finishing these plants, and it shouldn't take long today because a lot of what we're covering you are familiar with, except for the fruit part, which you may or not be familiar with. So flower structure, this topic you should be familiar with. It's what we opened this unit with. Some plants are have girl and boy parts, and some plants are separate sexes. So you have male and female plant. They have both. If they have both male and female organs on them, we call them monoecious. And if they have separate male and female plants, we call them dioecious. It just really depends on the species of plants. It doesn't say that these certain plants have to have are monoecious, and these are not. They're dioecious. We are holly bushes here in this area. If you have holly bushes, which are very common as far as foliage and they're decorative accents. If your holly bush has red little berries on it, you have a girl one. And if it never has red little berries, you have a boy one. So it just depends on that species and whether or not it's going to have, it's monoecious or dioecious. What I want you to pull from here is something we've already covered. Pollen is the male gamete for flowers. Is it a megaspore or a microspore? Microspore. And where is pollen stored in a plant? Anther. That's what I wanted you to pull from this. Okay, and of course there's some pollen grains up close. And then the ovule. The ovule is where the baby actually is. So you have the ovule, then you have the seed coat, then you have the ovary. So ovule, seed coat, and then ovary. When we talk about the ovule inside, is that a microspore or megaspore? Mega, because the girl is mega. And when we start with one cell, how many megaspores do we end up with when we go through meiosis? You should end up with 4, but how many survive? 1. Very much like humans, where we start off with our stem cell, we have 4 potential eggs, and one of them is much larger. The other 3 will end up dying, and we have one that is actually capable of being fertilized. So very similar with what we see in animals. Okay, we're going to go through fruits now after we discuss fertilization process. You and I have discussed when pollen sticks to the very top of the female portion of the plant, the carpel or the pistil, but the very top is called the stigma. Once that pollen reaches there, as it begins to fertilize, it will form a pollen tube. So the pollen tube is not there. It grows once the pollen is introduced. What we see here is that some plants have the ability to exercise self-incompatibility, which means that it doesn't want to have babies with its own sperm. So it doesn't want to self-fertilize. Can you tell me what benefit naturally that plant or that organism would have as a result of self-incompatibility? Genetic variation. So it's increasing the amount of genetic material introduced and the amount of variation. So you can see here, we have a stigma and a pollen grain attaches, and it recognizes it as non-self, so it begins to form a pollen tube. Here we have 2 pollen grains attached. One is recognized as self, and no pollen tube is generated. The non-self one generates a pollen tube. And you can see that both of these were recognized as self-pollen, so it will not generate a pollen tube. Okay, so increasing genetic variation. All right, you already know that a seed knows the difference between up and down. What do we call that? The fact that it can recognize this part needs to go up and this part needs to go down. Apical, basal, polarity. Apical, basal, polarity. So no matter how you put the seed in the ground, it will adjust itself so that part of that seed can grow the root or the shoot system, and part of it can grow the root system. Okay, so all that means is that the root apical meristem is on one end, shoot apical meristem is on the other. What's the purpose of the physical seed? So you have the embryo inside. What's the purpose of the seed? Protection. Yes, protection. Okay. Do you remember what a dicot is, first of all? What does that mean? This is from your first lab in the first part of this unit. Dicot versus monocot. Two seed leaves. And it could be called dicot or u3p4d2. We don't say seed leaf because that's too simple. Obviously in science we want to be difficult, so we say cotyledons. It mentions that when it establishes apical and basal polarity, that the apical side, the one that's going to be the shoot system, has what we call an epicotyl and a hypocotyl, which I'm going to show you. You don't have to be familiar with. And then the root system is established by the radicle. All that is are the baby names for those tissues. So eventually it'll become the stem and the leaves. Eventually it'll become the root. But here's what we call it when it was just a baby tissue. This is not a common drawing that you and I would see in biology, but in anatomy we always look at different views, different cross-sections. Okay, so here we have a dicot that has been opened up, but you can see that it's germinating. What does the term germinate mean? It's starting to grow. Okay, this part right here is going to shoot up against the dirt first. What hormone is present in high levels as this epicotyl starts to push through that dirt? What hormone?
Does it start with an E?
It does start with an E. It's a stress hormone. Ethylene. Yes. Ethylene is the stress hormone that you would find in large quantities as this seedling is trying to push through. That crusty soil is what it mentioned in your book. But this portion right here is called the epicotyl. Then we have the hypocotyl, and here's the radicle. So this is just showing you this will be the shoot system, and right here this will develop the root system. What's the purpose of all of this? If that's the actual baby, what's the purpose? Yeah, protection and nutrients while it waits for favorable conditions. You can't go wrong with that. We have this same setup here. This is what we would call a frontal cut, and this is a side cut, so it'll be a sagittal cut. So you're just looking at the same seed, just different cuts. Okay, still labeling the epicotyl, the hypocotyl, and the radicle, so you can just see the different parts. The epicotyl and hypocotyl will eventually become the shoot system, and the radicle will become that root system. All right, fruits. What's the whole okay, first of all, what is a fruit? It's an ovary. So it's an ovary. It's a plant ovary. In the middle, we have the seed, and then the embryo is in the middle of that seed. So it goes embryo, seed, ovary. What's the purpose of fruits? Reproduction. But how are fruits used for reproduction? They do contain seeds. But what is the fruit's job? Get something to be attracted to it. Oh, you like apples. Okay, well, you're helping apple trees have babies. You like bananas, you're helping bananas. So the whole purpose of a fruit is to attract a pollinator. So it is sexual reproduction, but it is looking to attract a pollinator. Now, it mentions that a fruit is nothing more than an ovary, and its goal, of course, is to protect that seed, but it helps disperse these seeds. Okay? And we're going to talk about two types of fruits, fleshy fruits and dry fruits. Most people think of fruits and they think of like oranges and apples, but also like walnuts, pecans, and those are all considered fruits too. They're just dry fruits. So we're going to go through just a couple. We're not going through a whole plethora of fruits. And in your lab, it did ask you to kind of distinguish between fruits and vegetables. And so hopefully, maybe some of this is like, oh, I didn't know that because you didn't come across this, but generally speaking, you should have some type of familiarity. Simple fruit is just a fruit that has a seed in the middle and a fruit on the outside. Okay, so basic simple fruits. Of course, a peach is a good example. Here we have aggregate fruits. Aggregate fruits are defined, and I don't want you to be confused because we're going to talk about multiple fruits here in just a moment, but aggregate fruits have multiple ovaries, but they're on one flower. So multiple ovaries on one flower. So this is an aggregation of ovaries right there. Multiple seeds as a result. So multiple ovaries, multiple seeds on one flower. Aggregate fruits. I don't think I mentioned what the term pericarp is. Pericarp is the very outside layer of that fruit. If you have a fleshy fruit, and like an apple, that very outside layer is its pericarp. If you have a dry fruit like a pecan, its pericarp is that shell, that papery thin shell. Or like an almond, it's a shell. Walnut, it's a shell. So I don't think I mentioned that term. I know I did in third. Accessory fruits. Accessory fruits, it mentions that the fruit develops from the floral parts as well as the ovaries. So it's taking this whole area and dividing itself or creating an entire fruit with multiple seeds. Could have multiple ovaries, multiple seeds to create this fruit. Here we have a strawberry. We call it an accessory fruit. These are the individual fruits with the seeds inside. Put together, you have multiple seeds within that fruit. Okay, so it's all, and it's usually from one flower, but it develops from that floral part. So accessory fruits, individual fruits within that large one. Multiple fruits. You have multiple ovaries and multiple flowers. Multiple ovaries and multiple flowers. So each of these right here, this is a pineapple, if you didn't recognize it. You have a flower with a fruit. A flower with an ovary. Flower with an ovary. Flower with an ovary. Flower with an ovary. Flower. These are all individuals, and they all come together as one large organism. Okay, so we consume the larger pineapple, but those are individual flowers with individual ovaries all put together, all coming together. So it's multiple fruit by definition. Different from an aggregate fruit, which is multiple ovaries but one flower. Okay, specialized fruits. These are dry. These are common in our area. What's the purpose of this structure? To move. With what? The wind. These are maple seeds, and so when the wind blows, they have that little wing. The goal is that it kind of swirls in that wind current. It carries it away from that parent plant. But why away from the parent plant? They are not competing for resources. So the goal is the parent knows, I've already got monopoly over these resources. I need you to get a little bit further away from me to increase your chances of survival. That's an example of a dry fruit. You know everything on here. But a seed, it may have a fruit, it may not have a fruit, but nonetheless, does it immediately start to germinate? Could it immediately start to germinate? Yes. But it doesn't have to. It can go through periods of dormancy in which it's waiting for favorable conditions. And that organism's favorable condition may vary from another one. So it mentions the fact that particular seeds may have different triggering factors, things that trigger its germination. It could be moisture, it could be sunlight, it could be temperature, it could be many things. But you know that that seed is waiting for its own favorable conditions before germinating. At this point, favorable conditions can't be the wrong answer. If you see that, that's what it is. Okay, I feel like you should be pretty confident in that response. U3p4d2, this is just going through, and this was very similar to what we saw in the lab. That's what we had there on that model. But you can see that the epicotyl will come out first, hypocotyl, and then the radical down here. Of course, if it's a dicot, what type of root system does it have to have? Taproot. Okay, it has two seed leaves, taproot. What about the vein pattern of the leaves? Netted or parallel? Netted. Should be a netted vein pattern. Monocot, there's no folding fanciness to it. It's very simple and straightforward. From its seedling, we have our radical, our root system goes down, our shoot system goes up. So it's just very simple, not as complex as we saw in this bean seedling. And this is the end of this plant unit. In your life, you never knew you were going to know so much about plants, and that's it. Are you excited? What do you have a question?
No, I said, you said, I was like saying something about what you said.